Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Stephanie LaRue. I am the Associate Director at CSREA, the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. CSREA is an interdisciplinary hub that aims to build community with the public and among scholars and students working on race and ethnicity in and around the United States. We invite you to learn more about us and our program offerings on our website, www.brown.edu/race. Today's event, entitled Mass Incarceration is a Feminist Struggle, Voices of Formerly Incarcerated Women, features a panel that centers on the voices and experiences of incarcerated women and their work to build communities free of mass incarceration. This event launches the Mass Incarceration Lab archive at the center and is a humanities lab project led by Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve, Associate Professor of Sociology at Brown University. The Humanities Lab initiative is generously funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Our hosts this afternoon are Dr. Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve, Associate Professor of Sociology and Esteem Brumfield, graduate student in public health and lead researcher of the Mass Incarceration Lab at Brown. At this time, I'll turn things over to Professor Van Cleve. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you to CSREA and everyone who put this event together and made this possible. I want to just tell you quickly about the source of inspiration of this idea of having a mass incarceration lab and an archive of what we've called the social life of mass incarceration. During the shutdown for COVID, I worked with my friend and colleague, Professor Nina Johnson at Swarthmore University. And we had a common friend named Thomas Ream Cotton, who was 54 years old and who we knew from the Graterford prison. His story was powerful. He was incarcerated for 28 years and released. And I still remember the day that I saw him walking into a coffee shop in Philadelphia at Uncle Bobby's. And my face was lit up with joy because it was the first time that I had seen Ream free, as a free person. And tragically he passed during the pandemic, taking care of his mother, who was struck ill by COVID, and then he in turn struck ill. And so we thought about what is the ways in which we can preserve the powerful testimony and stories of people that have lived through and found life after incarceration. And we thought about it as centering the stories as indicators of what incarceration is in this era and the importance of that act of preservation. We wanted to, in some ways, capture the oral testimonies, the writing, the quote unquote living history of mass incarceration and its legacies in all its forms. And so today is kind of a celebration of the launch. We are so lucky to have an amazing team of researchers. Much of this lab experience was conducted in 2 classes, a PhD seminar in the Department of Sociology, as well as an undergraduate seminar that was taught this summer with some of our freshmen and sophomores. And the students took great care into preserving and respectfully archiving the oral histories of so many people impacted by incarceration, but also preserving letters and other, kind of relics, if you will, that indicate the intent of the system, the violent intent of the system. And so today is really a celebration of that. I want to thank Esteem Brumfield, who will be hosting. He has been the unsung hero, the research director, if you will, the master archivist. That has really made this archive possible. And I give him, it's one thing to envision a project and its scope. It's another thing to make it happen and come to life. And he's going to conduct this panel, which will be part of the archive. So thank you to the panelists. I'll let Esteem do the honors and take over the hosting. And thank you all for coming and tuning in and seeing the work that we've done.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Van Cleve, for that introduction. I want to start out by absolutely thanking the panelists for being here today. You are such remarkable leaders in your field, and we really wanted to showcase this project with you all. And we're really proud of the work that we've done over the summer. So thank you for being here. And another important group of people that I just wanted to acknowledge before we start are the library team at the John Hay Library. To Ellie, to Ashley, to Karen, to Cody. Thank you so much on the back end, the work that you've done to make this a reality. And especially want to thank all of the families and individuals who have contributed their stories and their letters to the project for the social life of mass incarceration and our website. We received over about 130 oral interviews and over 100 letters in terms of trying to archive this project. And so I want to extend my deepest appreciation for the folks who have submitted. And for anyone out there who's interested in submitting written testimony to be preserved in the library, we want to invite you to do so. We have our information listed here. And we also want to invite you to follow the newsletters for the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. The newsletter will be launching our official site that you can check out. And so when the site launches, we encourage you to explore our exhibits that we have here of wide variety. And as you submit more and more, the exhibits will only just increase. And so we're really excited to have that. We're really excited to showcase some of the most powerful testimony. And it was this testimony that launched this archive. One of the formerly incarcerated women that we had submit her testimony talked about how she wishes society would recognize that punishing people in prison, abusing people in prison won't make our society safer. And it was with that I wanted to ensure that we had a panel discussion on feminism, because I believe abolition is a feminist movement. And so with that, I would like to introduce the panelists that we have for today. We're joined by three incredible leaders. Cherie Cruz, along with fellow Rhode Islanders, co-founded the former Incarcerated Union of Rhode Island, a membership-driven nonprofit organization founded and led by people who've been directly impacted by the criminal justice system, with the goal of advocating for reducing barriers to reentry and ending incarceration. Thank you very much, Cherie, for being here today. And we're also joined by Aminah Elster. Aminah is a campaign and policy coordinator with the California Coalition for Women Prisoners, where she leads its work on reproductive oppression in women's prisons. Thank you, Aminah. And we also have Daniela Medina. She's the co-founder and host of the Berkeley Underground Scholars podcast, On the Tier, and she's also the assistant director of the Underground Scholars at UC Berkeley. Thank you for being here. And so I wanted to jump right in with the three of you. Could we situate our audience? I noticed that we have a wide range of audience members. Some are quite familiar with incarceration. Some are quite familiar with the topics of abolition, and then others have never heard of the word. So maybe we could start out just by giving some context. Could you speak to how the criminal justice system has impacted women in the United States? And I open that up to anyone who cares to jump in first and tackle that. Cherie, I don't want to put you on the spot, but can I put you on the spot? Oh, you're muted. We can't hear you.
No. Thanks for putting me on the spot, So and can you repeat that, please, for me?
Yeah, sure. Could you tell us some of the ways that the criminal justice system is particularly impacting women? I know that you and I have spoken about this at great length, whether it's charging for hygiene products for women who are currently incarcerated, or whether it's the DAs and police who are coercing women to testify against their partners, and if they don't, they'll receive higher sentencing. Maybe just paint a broad picture for the audience of how is this impacting women?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for, kind of bringing back some of that conversation. What we see every day on the ground, I know here in Rhode Island, I'm sure Danielle and Aminah see as well in their work, is this gender-based violence, right, that we see every day that happens to women, whether they're giving birth in shackles, not receiving, you know, as my mother had in Framingham to my brother, not giving medical care. Too many times, you know, when it comes to healthcare, I see women who come out every day and have no teeth before the age of 30 because they pulled them within the prison system, just as my mother had, right? So when we talk about this gender-based violence, it's real. I mean, Esteem, we think about, you know, women's issues, and these are basic things, right? Like feminine hygiene products. And you've got states in Rhode Island we just passed that'll start in 2022, but we think for decades and decades, women had to find a way to pay for these products when they had their menstrual cycle every month. So you think just basic hygiene products they didn't have access to, just to cage them, for things that were related, and we know mostly for women, are related to poverty issues, things around education and employment, caring for their children, lack of opportunities. I mean, our society is built on gender-based violence, right? And now we're seeing the uptick in prisons and caging women for this exact same thing. So I'll stop there before I go on, because I see Aminah and Danielle, and I definitely want to have them jump into this because I'm sure you have so much more to add.
Thanks, Cherie. Thank you for setting that stage and that context. And I just want to also add that it's important to note that 86% of women in jails are survivors of sexual violence, and 77% are survivors of intimate partner violence. And, you know, in practice, and so if you hear me referring to these women as survivors, that is because the majority of them are survivors of some form. And they are subjected, like Cherie said, to harsher punishments. They are incarcerated throughout their childbearing years. They are further victimized by prison staff and correctional doctors. Our children are put up for adoption or we lose our parental rights. We are separated from our children and families and forced to create our own programs to support healing, with very little support inside as well as during the reentry period. And Cherie also talked about the collateral consequences of incarceration of women and healthcare. You know, people in women's prisons have been sterilized, forcefully, coercively sterilized while in prison, which is a form of violence. People inside of women's prisons are continuously given subpar medical health care. And then once they are released, is only in California, we have maybe one health provider that really services formerly incarcerated people. Other than that, you know, it's finding a job. And we know that there's consequences behind having criminal records and the type of jobs that you can get. So there's a whole list of issues while incarcerated and continues after incarceration that impact women and mothers and trans and GNC people that are imprisoned inside of women's prisons.
Thank you both for highlighting that. Yeah, I think that definitely hits home, and just to kind of go back to the period of sterilizations that were going on in California around 2011 and during that time in Valley State Prison when I was incarcerated. And just to kind of put into context that a lot of people, you know, people who haven't been incarcerated tend to ask a lot of questions about safety concerns and violence in prison and seem to think that it's kind of like the movies. And what were you scared? Were you scared of shanks and that type of violence? And are pretty shocked when I kind of tell them that my biggest fear during that process was being sterilized. And there is a lot of conversation around that, but just that, just the idea of being there and seeing other young women, so many women who are not older, who it was just a general practice of getting, receiving hysterectomies and, you know, being told that they had, you know, could get cancer if they didn't have their ovaries removed and things like that. And then just also just really, you know, being in fear of coming home without my ovaries. And it sounds really harsh, but that is the reality of the day-to-day, like being scared every day of like, I just want to make it out. I just want to come home whole. And even talking about like the dental thing. And that's not something that a lot of people talk about, but like coming home and finally having like a good job and getting benefits, and then realizing that you have so much dental work that you have to pay for. And I remember once I was getting off parole, I was thinking, I'm going to get off parole, I'm going to go on this vacation. And then the reality hit that I would not, because I had to pay up to like $10,000 in dental work, just from how much they damaged my teeth and just disregarded, my mouth. And so yeah, thank you all for just highlighting that. It sounds horrific, but it's real.
Danielle, I wanted to pick up a little bit of what you just touched upon about some of the misconceptions that people might have, particularly from media, from TV shows like Orange is the New Black, about the particular type of violence and what your actual concerns are when you're in prison. When my mother was pregnant with me in prison, she was spotting. She wasn't sure whether or not she was actually going to be able to deliver. When she was at the delivery bed, she was shackled. The officer told the nurse that she needed to be shackled because we didn't want her to escape. The nurse said, "What makes you think this woman is going to be escaping as she's delivering birth?" And so a lot of her fear was around her access to medical care, around the actual institution. And who came through for her were the women. The women provided her with extra food, albeit it wasn't nutritious, but at least it was more nutritious than the limited meal she had. Could you talk a little bit about the solidarity that women build for each other?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember in that time, right? I mean, part of it is like some underground information. Like during this time, everybody knew that Dr. Heinrich was not a good doctor to go to. People knew he was performing hysterectomies, but women, we didn't have access to internet, to Google, like, what does this even mean? We had the Women's Advisory Council president, or somebody who was working doing a bunch of like 602s, a bunch of appeals against the medical system, and like just being told that, being denied. And then later we come home and we see that this thing blew up, right? It wasn't just our imagination. So it's just that type of support, like women coming together, helping do appeals process, helping other people write appeals, even though at that time those appeals were not going anywhere. That's what women were doing in solidarity. Also just taking care of each other. What do you tell women when they are going to get surgery, right? They say they found a lump in one of your breasts, and it has to be removed. And then they actually remove the wrong breast. And then you have to go back, and then now you have both breasts removed. And those things happen with teeth too. It's like, oh, they took the wrong tooth, so now I have to get the other tooth. And this was very normalized in prison, right? People were just, it was shocking to me when I first got there, but then you become very, very used to it, and in a way that you just have to adapt, and we just support each other. I mean, what could we do but support each other? And so for us, we really always just came together, whether it was like providing food. Hey, are you okay? Do you need medicine? Do you need anything? I'll pick up your food for you today and leave it at your door. So those are some of the ways that we came together.
Yeah. Yeah, that's care work, right? And it's this that collective care work. And I would just add too that it was people that were incarcerated that reached out to other organizations, asking questions about, medical procedures, and also like sticking around the medical office and talking to other women who had just came out from seeing Dr. Heinrich and finding out what happened, taking notes, documenting everything that happened. And then I managed to have a hearing, which later exposed all this. So it came from the organizing, the collective care of folks on the inside. And if it wasn't for folks speaking up, because it's not easy to speak up in prison. It sounds easy, but there's repercussions. So the majority of people, especially in California's prisons, are serving long-term sentences. And with long-term sentences, for especially life sentences, you have to go before the parole board. Now, if you get a disciplinary infraction, you ruin your chances at freedom. And officers, medical staff, they abuse power in prison, and they can write you up for, being what they call out of bounds. And that can be 1 foot over a line that you're not supposed to be over, and that could cost you your freedom. So people having the guts to speak up, the strength to speak up about what is happening to people's bodies, and asking questions, allowed for California to be the first state in the country to provide reparations for people that were sterilized in California prisons just this year.
Cherie, did you care to jump in?
Yeah, and I'll just, because so much was already said, but we see, firsthand that inhumane and abusive treatment by the state, right, of women, and we jump into action as women. And I think even for the first time when I was incarcerated, when I was pregnant, I was fortunate to have my mother there who already knew this system. And, we were in jail, and then she got out, and then the first person I saw was my sister-in-law while I'm held in a cage. Pregnant, and the first thing she said is, "What do you need?" So you got that care right away when you came. They knew what you were about to experience, and what was going to happen to you. So is that type that even when we created our organization in 2019, women started to see us, and we started to do some campaigns, and we just got, a letter from a woman, "Hey, I was homeless. I went to an abandoned building. Now I'm doing a year in a cage because I couldn't afford housing." And so knowing they have to reach out, and like you said, Aminah, the repercussion, asking for someone to help, because we know, that these are the reasons women, at least here in Rhode Island, is they cycle them in and out for reasons of poverty. And I'm sure it's like that across the country. So it's reliant on us to stick together and not to forget those women who are left behind, to make sure until we get them home and give them the supports they need in the community, to never be abused by that system again.
Flowing into that, could we talk a little bit about what are the ways that the carceral system continues to try to control women's bodies post-release? How does that manifest? How have we seen that?
Well, we see that, like I spoke earlier about folks giving extreme sentencing. So like me, I was incarcerated throughout my childbearing years. I got out at 40 and suffered from infertility, also there is family separation. I had my son while I was incarcerated. I only spent 2 days in the hospital before he was taken by my parents. When I got out, he was 17 years old. So I'm still trying to establish a relationship with my son. I'm trying to get to know him as he's trying to get to know me, because the entire 15 years that I was incarcerated, he was kept from me. We talk about social participation and the right to vote. Finally, people on parole in California can vote, but before that, and in many other states, if you've been convicted of a crime, you can no longer vote. So there goes your freedom to engage in our civic duties, and also our social participation when we're talking about maybe running for office, or, getting occupational licensing, or even, when we are seeking higher education, there are all these barriers in the way. And number one, of course, is housing, and in California, housing is in short supply. There's not a lot of transitional homes that are geared to support women coming home and children, mostly for men, so that leaves a lot of women on the street, or having to go back into communities and situations that are not healthy for them. And I'll let Danielle, if you want to add a few more.
Yeah, I can give an example of being on parole and being mandated to take like anger management class. We had to meet this quota, they have to meet quotas and these service providers that they have contracts with. And having to take an anger management class, even though I was working, trying to, you just get a job and you really can't miss work, but yet you're being mandated to attend these classes once a week that are in the middle of the daytime. And then taking these classes and being the only woman in the whole group. So now I'm in a group with all men talking about anger management and domestic violence, and being mandated, right? And not wanting to go anymore. And I think I missed a few and was threatened with being sent back to prison. And when I raised the issue that there were no other women, I didn't feel comfortable, being in talking about domestic violence and anger management and just violence in general, being the only woman with a bunch of men. They said that there were no other groups. There were other groups for just women, but I would have to pay for those. So those services were not included for me because I was a woman. So that's just one example.
Sharif.
And I'll just add, you hear the generational impact, and it doesn't end with just the person who's behind, but their children and their communities. And you hear this scream public health crisis, right? Because this is a generational trauma that these types of systems just keep passing down and down. And when you talk about voting rights and when they're outside, and when Daniela talked about, she would have to pay to get that class required by the court, but talk about gender violence, right? And this is specific to it. It's like we can give you thousands of examples of it, and that yet it continues. So it's just this re-victimizing of women by the state that we need to really get a hold of. So I want to thank Danielle and Aminah for sharing that.
Thank you. I wanted to remind folks to please submit your questions. We'll be having a Q&A towards the end of this panel, and we'd love to hear from you all. Maybe I was wondering if the three of you could speak a little bit about the work that you each are doing to combat some of the issues that you just articulated. In your day-to-day work, what are you doing to build those pathways of freedom for women? Aminah, can I start with you?
Yes, you can. Thanks, Esteem. So what I do day to day is I legislate, I advocate for policy changes that really center criminalized survivors that are sentenced to prison for acts of self-defense when in a I'm gonna say a nation that doesn't value Black bodies, and so therefore it doesn't see a self to defend. And I'm in constant collaboration and communication with people that are currently incarcerated, taking their leadership in their direction, listening to what is going on in there, and also informing and sharing with other advocates and organizers that I currently work with in my work. I'm also trying to increase information flows. I think that inside of institutions, there is a limit. There's a limited amount of information that can get in and gets out. So a lot of people that are incarcerated are unaware of a lot of things. So by providing information, and sharing resources helps to educate folks inside and place them at a better position to be able to fight for their liberation. I am constantly, all of my work revolves around criminalized survivors because that is my experience. And I know that, and a lot of my peers that are currently inside, depend on us to come out and elevate and share and talk about, the struggles and the obstacles and possible solutions that people inside of women's prisons can benefit from. And that's how I work towards the end of a lot of carceral policies that my community faces and is confronted with today.
For myself, currently working with Berkeley Underground Scholars, a program that supports
currently incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people in accessing higher education, which really changed the trajectory of my life. Having completed my AA while I was incarcerated and coming home and having that support from other formerly incarcerated people at UC Berkeley, kind of like paving the way for me to move forward. And so that's something I'm really passionate about, is just really providing that access, especially to folks who are currently incarcerated. So whether that's sharing information about the program, connecting with folks, connecting them to community colleges, and then helping them with the actual transfer process. I was the first woman from my program, from my incarcerated program, to get accepted into UC Berkeley, or to a UC at all. And since I've been there, there have been 3 other women that I was currently incarcerated with, who have been accepted to UC Berkeley. So just continuing that work is really important to me, and making sure I'm always prioritizing and centering women. I know for a long time, our program was just going into a lot of the men's prisons, right? Education is very prevalent in the men's prison. I mean, they have podcasts, they have all types of, newsletters and visitors, like just so many programs, yoga, you name it, they have it. And the women just don't have anything. They don't have visitors, they don't have people trying to, they don't have people knocking at the door trying to get in there to provide them services. So like, just one of the ways is I just have never gone into a men's prison, and I don't know how people feel about that, but that's just one of the things. I will not go into a men's prison. There's plenty of other people that can do that, and that are doing that, and will do that. So for the first time, we actually went into CCWF, where I was incarcerated at, while I was there. And just personally, still, I have been home 7 years, just continuously supporting women who are incarcerated, especially long-termers and lifers, providing them letters of support, still showing up for their court dates. So now there are virtual Zoom court dates and resentencing hearings and board dates, and providing letters of support and just showing up. Like Aminah said, providing information. When the pandemic first happened and we first went into this sort of lockdown, a lot of people were, worried about, okay, how is this going to affect me? And I think the first thing that I thought about, and I know the same probably for everyone else, is how is this going to affect the women who are incarcerated, right? Because if we're talking about a lockdown and we're talking about a shortage of toilet paper and things, imagine how the women are going to be affected. And so I think a lot of us went into like this quick thinking action, and created like a lot of systems, mutual aid support. And I just remember I started asking my followers, because I see a lot of mutual aid being done on social media, and I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna put it out there. I'm like, if anybody wants to support women who are incarcerated, they are going to be going on a full lockdown soon, and they're not going to be able to have hygiene. They're not going to be able to have food. If you want to support, just Venmo me. And really was just able to, I was really surprised to be able to like raise thousands of dollars over those couple months, like the couple months when things first started happening, and was able to continue that during like the holidays, and then again during Mother's Day. And I'll probably do another one again as the holidays approach. But that's just one of the things that, we kind of think about, how are we going to support them without really depending on these systems, because we know that those systems, especially the institution, is not gonna provide the support that they need.
Yeah, wow, just amazing work, and we see how it can be done. And for us, hear a lot of advocacy around decriminalization. We know for us here, over 66% of the women go in unemployed, 25% less than a high school diploma. So we know there's a lack of all of those things, and housing, like we shared. So those are things we're advocating. One of the big things too is working on projects like keeping our families together and parent caregiver legislation. So when our primary caregivers, who are mostly women, are facing a sentence, that we do everything we can to keep those families together, that the women do not have to go behind bars and separate a family. Especially, no matter what, the right to breastfeed. We do support a lot of women who've been formerly incarcerated, who are involved with the child welfare system, who even just a short time while incarcerated can take years to get their children back and reunited. So we talk about that trauma on infants and attachment and the lifelong issues with that. So working on projects like Keeping Families Together that we've been working on to make sure that these systems stop tearing our families apart and women, you know, can be with their children. So that's some of like the large things. Voting rights. We passed voting rights back in 2006. Which still isn't being upheld. You know, my parents died without having that right to vote. I was able to be re-enfranchised, but there's still individuals, so we, you know, that have the right, who are being held without being convicted of anything or serving misdemeanors, who are still being denied that right to vote, aren't giving access to that right to vote. So it's really working on universal suffrage and making sure everyone has that right to vote. So these are just a touch of some of the things. And, you know, working on a women's commission to make sure we close it down, we shut it down. In Rhode Island, we have anywhere from 80 to up to 130 women who are incarcerated, very small number. So we know that we can shut that prison down and really give people, and really take that money and reinvest it into the communities and support those families in the communities.
Thank you everyone for sharing that. I think that builds off the next question that I wanted to ask. Around abolition. I noticed that there are quite a few people who may not have ever heard of the word abolition who are joining today, or 150 years from now in the future who are watching this archive. Could you maybe take a brief moment to explain what abolition is? I think a lot of people oftentimes see media sensationalizing the idea that abolition is just defunding the police, or it's just closing down a prison. Rather, the idea of abolition is to build something. Could you speak to a little bit about that?
I could talk about that. And I could talk about that in many aspects, I think, in the work that we all do. But I mean, I could talk about, like, for instance, with Berkeley Underground Scholars and the work that we've been doing in providing and helping people access higher education, and how it really started from formerly incarcerated students that met on campus, really grassroots, and really has grown and has grown because of the efforts of the people doing the work. Even though, you know, a lot of people might think we're embedded in the university or whatnot, all of the work that we've done on our own. You know, we've had situations where now, for instance, like the probation department, or like different carceral systems are trying to get involved with education now, right? Now they see that it's grown and they want a part of it, right? And part of it is, instead of redistributing that money, they want to still control that money. So part of it is like they want to provide a grant and they want to partner with services like ours, right? And us saying, us saying we do not want that partnership, we do not need that partnership, we do not want to legitimize the work that you're trying to do here because we've been doing it on our own and we really are not going to get anything out of it. And not just that, because some of those grants that are tied to education, right, would mean having to report on students and their progress. So it's really just extending the carceral state. It's not helping us in any way. And us really putting our foot down and saying, we will not be a part of that. We do not want that funding. And in a lot of situations, we lose a lot of funding. And there are other organizations and programs who will take that money because they don't have those funds and they need it for their program. And so for us, it's really been, it's difficult, obviously, to pass up funding that's going to support our program, but like having to really stick to our morals and our values and saying that, we will not legitimize that work.
And for you, Aminah, what does abolition mean to you?
Yeah, so I think, it's a great question. And for me, abolition is shifting resources and power to community interventions. And this is what where building community comes in, right? So no, it's not just defunding the police, although we do want to divert resources from them and invest into community interventions. And in order to do that, that takes community building and that takes community engagement. And really what abolition is about, it is about creating. It's not just about dismantling, but we also must create. And in order to create, you know, that means working across systems, you know, because abolition is also present. It's being present in spaces that we I haven't had access to before, such as coming in the back door of the courthouse, but now coming in the front and sitting down at the table and meeting with district attorneys and telling or sharing them, you know, my expertise, giving recommendations and things like that. So it's working across systems. And it's really focused on community responses, community interventions. It shifts the power from carceral systems, institutions, police, prosecutions, courts, even medical healthcare, in some instances, prison medical healthcare, and shifting that power and resources into community. And that's what abolition is to me.
And just to not repeat and underscore, but also just to add across those systems is looking at those systems that are feeding mass incarceration, right? From everything from educational systems with school to prison pipelines, where we're having kids in handcuffs by third grade and seeing a cell before puberty, right? And these are things I've seen with my eyes, right? So these aren't just, this is happening, right? And we talk about recovery houses. You know, I see every day that if they relapse a normal condition of your medical condition, the police are called. Or they're thrown out onto the street back to homelessness, which we know is a pipeline into the prison system. So it's individuals and organizations taking a really hard look at their policies, their practice, their procedures, and what that looks like. And you know, if it ends up to incarcerate, then you're doing it wrong. You need to fix it. And that's where you need to really build with the community and start looking at that. Because as Daniela so nicely put as well, is the extension of the carceral state, right? It's like when we argue for parent caregiver legislation, like, oh, we'll put a nursery in there. No, we do not want to put another human being in this toxic, abusive environment so we can further traumatize generations. And that's the thing. We do not want to support those types of systems. And we really need to take a hard look, like both Aminah and Daniel, across the systems, not feed into it. So the things we're doing in the community on the ground, well-meaning people, we really need to look at all these different systems and how it's feeding in and fix it.
Could I stay with that for just a moment? You and I have talked about this, Cherie, at length, that a lot of services and programs provided for pregnant women in prison, in order for those women to qualify, they have to be considered low risk. They have to be close to their release date. Otherwise, they don't qualify. And the logic in my mind is always, well, why do we, if you say that they can be released within such a short period of time, why are you incarcerating them to begin with? If you think that they're low risk and then you're going to give them services, why do we wait to not, why don't we just release them right now? Can you maybe expand on that a little bit more?
Why did they even go in the first place, right? So, yeah. I mean, we all know, and hopefully we all know who's listening in, this is a profit, this is a business, right? And it's really a business of destroying human beings and communities, and that's what it does. I mean, there's like you said, Esteem, there's no, you can argue there's no safety, so then why are they here in the first place? And it is a money game, unfortunately. And there could be alternatives right from the start before they even see a prison. So, you know, I think you hit on that. It's this lust for control and punishment we have in our society, right? If somebody's looking back from 100 years, have we ended that? This, you know, desire and appetite for control and punishment, and particularly of certain people, we know Black and Native Americans are like one of the highest when it comes to all these negative impacts, right? So it's like, can we look back and say, have we given up, you know, this fascination that we want to do that, you know, and Aminah talked about, you know, survivors. I remember, you know, I was harmed by my daughter's father and the police came, and what was the first response? He has to go to prison. I don't want him to go to prison. That's my child's father. I want him to get help. And when we're given the only choice by police, by prosecutors, by courts, by society, that the only way to live together is to put another human being in a cage, a loved one in a cage, is like, when do we change this thinking? So, I mean, that's where I come, and you know, I'm passionate about this team, and it's like, we have a fixation in this country that we just, this is the solve everything. I mean, I remember what a judge had told me when, you know, I begged for my 20-year-old son not to go to prison, as a mother, you know, for a trespassing charge at 18 months. And the judge said, you know, he'll learn a lot by staring at a brick wall. No one will learn by staring at a freaking brick wall. And these are the people that control our lives, right? So that never left me. I remember writing letters and thinking, you know, he'll learn a lot by staring at a brick wall. So that's what our system is built upon.
How do we separate the idea of punishment and justice? Going back to that interview that was conducted this summer with that woman who said that society needs to realize that torturing people in prison is not going to make society safer. How do we separate the idea of retribution and justice? Can there ever be punishment and justice? Or they live mutually exclusive?
Well, when I gave the example of, you know, being a victim of DV, and justice for me wasn't punishment for him. And I was arrested because I wouldn't testify. So they said, you know, my lust for getting this system going is, you know what, if you don't play by our rules, we're just going to also arrest you. We're going to also criminalize you. So I feel like, you know, that punishment and justice, I mean, you can have justice without punishment in the sense that it exists right now, right? And it's repair. It's about restoring and repairing people, and it's about providing supports and meeting people where they're at. So
Yeah, thanks, Cherie, and thanks, Esteem, for this question. And I think also it's important that we have to change narratives. So like right now, you know, largely mainstream controls the narrative, this crime and punishment, justice narrative. And it's as advocates and organizers, it's on us to really get out there and help try to shift that narrative, whether that is you know, speaking more about, like Cherie was saying, like her perspective, sharing her perspective about what is justice, you know, and like what exactly is punishment, you know, because punishment to one person could not be punishment to another person. And I totally believe that justice is benefiting from state protection rather than suffering from state violence. And so who gets justice here? And who, you know, I think we need to look at who we're giving justice to, who is allowed to get to seek justice and who's not. But that is a great question.
I'll just add that when people, you know, for people like myself, or, you know, people might see us as, you know, like successful, you know, you went to prison and then you changed and now you're doing so great. And I just want to highlight that it was not because of the punishment, right? It was because of the people inside doing the work. So people are inside doing work. And a lot of the support that I got, the only support that I got was from other incarcerated people who were lifers, who were serving life sentences and did not eat, some of them did not even have a chance to go to board, to even get out, and were facilitating self-help groups with very minimal resources, who were guiding us, who me coming in as a young person, having people who had been there for 10 years or so saying, you know, do this, do that, you know, let me connect you excuse me, let me connect you to this self-help group or this education class. And really, I owe all of that to those folks that really helped me and helped me guide and navigate that system, because I come home and parole is not helping me, right? Parole is not the one who was helping. My parole officer was not the one who was helping me. It was people who had already gotten out who said, I know you're going to need this. I know you're going to need that. Here's a number to call. And we're still doing that now, right? We're still not depending on like parole or probation for housing. We're calling each other and saying, hey, I have this young lady who doesn't have housing. Do you have any leads? And it's still the people doing that work. And it's still the reason why we are doing the work for people who are still inside and trying to free them. So essentially, we're trying to free the people who are helping us, because I wouldn't be who I am today or where I am today had it not been for them.
Can I stay with you, Daniela? You mentioned earlier about how many programs are dedicated to male facilities and how volunteers flock to those facilities. And even Dr. Van Cleve and I talked about how many criminal justice panels we go to, and they're predominantly just men. What does intersectional feminism look like in the abolition movement? How do we build upon that to ensure that that is at the forefront? Because when I think of some of the most incredible examples of slave abolition, there were women who are the role models for that. And as we talk about prison abolition, that borrows from that framework. So in 150 years, if someone is looking at this archive, we want to make sure that we're that we're preserving the model of a feminist abolition for them to replicate. What has that looked like in your work? What does feminist abolition look like in your work, and how do we build on it?
I mean, it looks like us constantly having to elevate the voices of incarcerated women. It looks like us refusing to do work that doesn't include incarcerated women, or participate in things that don't include women. And part of that is, I understand that a lot of these prison facilities are in very rural parts of California where we're at, right? And so I understand that the men's prison, if they're in rural areas, a lot of them maybe don't receive as much services as somewhere like San Quentin that's in the Bay Area and more easily accessible. However, what you do see is that men's prisons are filled with visitors. There's never a lack of visitors visiting them. And for women, it's very few people who are able to see them, right? A lot of the times our family members are taking care of our children, are responsible for our children. If more than 80% of women are mothers that are incarcerated, those children are most likely with their family members. So, that's another barrier. So for me, I would just say, how are we prioritizing women? And then there's always the excuse of there's less women, right? So they're not going to spend the funding. They're not going to pay for something if there's only this many women. But the women are coming home and coming straight into, supporting their families, becoming head of household right out of prison again. So why are we not prioritizing women?
Yeah, thanks, Daniela. And I think with intersectional feminism, it's important that we not just like look at gender. We have to also factor in race. We're factoring in sexuality. We're factoring in, other intersections in that person's individual that have resulted that has resulted in like harm, discrimination, violence, and things like that. And as Daniela was speaking about, the overabundance of support for men's prisons and the lack thereof when it comes to women's prisons, I can speak to before I was incarcerated, my ex-husband was incarcerated. And I just remember traveling everywhere, all over California to go visit him. And during my treks, I would meet other women that were visiting their significant others. And, a lot of the work right now, comes from a lot of like women who are supporting formerly incarcerated men, and that's great, you know. But when it comes to women incarcerated, as soon as they're incarcerated, if they did have a man or husband, they're gone. You know what I'm saying? And so they don't have that support. And you know, the incarceration of men has been, you know, popularized. It's been, you know, glamorized. You know, so of course a lot of people flock to men. You know, there's a lot of, they show up on all the panels. There's a lot of you know, research and writings about them, very little about women. So it's really, you know, centering, what we're doing is we're centering women. We're centering the intersections, you know what I'm saying? And that is to grow our support, because there's a lot of intersections that work in silos. So by collaborating together, the goal is to grow our base, therefore grow support for women that are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated.
Yeah, not much more to add after that, because it's, I mean, everything you said. And Danielle, thank you for bringing up that point, because that excuse I hear over and over again, oh, there's less. So they get less, right? And yet, you know, as Aminah had shared too, and when women come out, they assume 90% of those parent caregiver responsibilities, whereas, you know, a study showed only 30% of men. So why wouldn't you invest the resources? Why wouldn't you? And I think just to say that we're only going to be able to get across all these systems in this intersectional if we do, again, like Aminah said, like in these silos, come together and really make it happen, because we are stronger together as long as we all come together. And in addition, continue to run for office. I know we saw here, you know, a woman who was directly impacted, who ran and won, and we're starting to see, we got feminine hygiene projects passed. We're working on parent caregiver. So we need more women, directly impacted women, running in these leadership roles, as we're uplifting them, also supporting them and running in these leadership roles to start to change some of this from that state level.
I wanted to remind folks, please submit your questions. We're going to transition to a Q&A in just a moment. But before I do, I wanted to do something a little different that I don't see enough of on panels. I wanted to invite the three of you to ask each other questions. I wanted this to be more of a collaborative feel, and I was curious to know what questions you have for each other's work. Maybe we could start with you, Cherie, and see if you had any questions for your fellow panelists and the work that they're doing.
So many questions. Look, well, and you know, I was thinking, you know, especially around education, and here we are on a Brown platform, and Danielle with UC Berkeley. I just, and you know, Aminah too, with around education, and we see such a, you know, the lack of access and opportunity for women. Like, what can, you know, what we can do, or maybe experiences of you with that intersection of education and being directly impacted. How do we start to open up that access? How do we start to get universities like UC Berkeley had, but Brown University, to start to do those types of things and channel them in? As someone who's an alumni, who is a first generation, you know, and my father, who, you know, kind of worked there with a felony, but then when they found out, they fired him on the spot. You know, we really want, they occupy communities with large amounts of people who are directly impacted. So how can they be good stewards of their community? And I want to hear more about kind of UC Berkeley, and how can like institutions like Brown and others can take examples and try to put this in play as well. And that's for either Aminah or Daniela.
Yeah, I think we both could speak to this. So definitely, I mean, I think that like underground scholars was started by students, right, who just happened to bump into each other and realize like, hey, you're incarcerated too. And then just started having like discussions and a reading group. They really didn't intend for it to become a huge program, right? They just wanted to support each other. And with that, they had faculty. So we had faculty on our campus who were 100% supportive, and that really grew. So just that institutional support, the support from faculty, I think was very really help the program grow. And we still have a lot of, we have like a faculty board. So we have a board of UC Berkeley faculty who, provide guidance, who provide support, who provide letters of rec, who invite our students to be a part of their research cohorts and in classes and things like that. And help advocate, right? Help advocate for space, help advocate on behalf of whenever students are having issues on campus, right? But I think the main thing is, how are we identifying folks, not identifying, but how are we welcoming folks? How are we seeing, are there folks who are impacted? Because even if there's not formally incarcerated, which I think there are a lot of formally incarcerated people who just don't feel comfortable coming out and saying that, we still have folks on our campus who, even with having our program, don't feel necessarily comfortable sharing that, right? Because there are some departments who are not as open to that, or people still get discriminated on our campus, even having that program and having a lot of knowledge about what we do and who we are. Our students are still getting discriminated against. Our students are still getting targeted by the UCPD. So definitely, I think it's like providing like a space, providing opportunity, and that could just look like, we're having a meeting, or welcoming folks who are justice impacted, and just providing that support, and once it start growing, like really advocating for space on campus, advocating for resources. Yeah, that's what I'll say.
Yeah, thanks, Daniela, and thanks, Cherie, for this question. And also for incarcerated scholars, I think this is why it's important, like information flows, because the program, Feather River College program, which was a program, the community college program that I took while incarcerated, if it wasn't for the professor who brought the information that, hey, UC Berkeley has an underground scholars program for formerly incarcerated scholars, we wouldn't have known. So it took for, messengers, having folks that are willing to share information, provide information. And what we did with that information is we took that information, we shared it with our peers, and just really became determined to succeed and be one of those people on the UC Berkeley campus. And that inspires hope for other folks. And that's what we continue to provide, like, support. And so it's also about like having the patience and the dedication and the compassion to work with incarcerated students as well, to provide academic advising so that folks know where they're going, what they should be doing, providing support, whether it be through letter writing or through prison visiting. But it's just making room, and like Daniela said, the space and the time to support individuals in whatever capacity you can. But academic advising is extremely important, because there are a lot of in prison college programs that just basically say, hey, here's a college program, pick a class and take it. And then we have students that's taking classes for 2 or 3 years, and none of them satisfy prerequisites to transfer over into a UC or a 4-year college. So that academic advising piece is really important.
If I could just quickly speak to that, that's so important. I've seen a lot of good programs that provide certifications for people who are incarcerated. And I'm not trying to put those programs down, because they are impactful and they are giving folks a sense of accomplishment. But there's no substitution for a bachelor's degree. There is absolutely no substitution. People don't want a separate but equal education system. And I could not stress that enough. Had it not been for underground scholars, I would not have felt a sense of home at UC Berkeley. And those programs are great that go into prisons and provide those certifications. Not at all trying to put them down, but at the end of the day, if you were to ask the average Brown student or the average Berkeley student, would they want a bachelor's degree or would they want a certificate? I think we know what the answer would be. We're going to get to some audience questions in just a moment, but we're still right now asking each other questions. Any questions, any more questions between the three of you?
Cherie, I think I would just want to ask, what are some of the barriers that come up in your work currently with women?
Housing. It's huge here. It's a crisis because it's a spiral. I say housing because it's a spiral effect along with substance use disorders. So what happens is if you can't pass a BCI, meaning you have a past criminal record, if you don't have good credit, this is what our landlords are doing here, right? So this is how they're, screening out people, even if they by chance might have had the money or there's a rent affordable, they screen them out based on those things. So it's huge because it's so huge that it impacts you as a parent, because that's when the child welfare system steps in and then says, hey, you can't be a parent because you can't afford housing or you can't find housing. And that's the spiral effect. So it's like, of all things, that foundation of housing for us is huge. Employment, substance use disorder, we're still criminalizing women who have it. When they go through a court case, they're getting drug tested, the father is not. They're given, so it's like this disproportionate, criminalization of women, even in child welfare, right? So the women are the ones being impacted. So we see that a lot, and it's frustrating because for a woman to, or a parent to have their child, that housing could be the reason they don't. And, I think for us here, it's really frustrating when we see they take the child and then give a foster parent $2,000 to $2,500 a month plus subsidies to take that child. And you think, you close to $133,000 to incarcerate her, then you take the child and then drain the system some more and then traumatizing by the whole, mental health disorders and trauma that they're going to face later in their life, that it just makes no sense. So I think for us, those are like huge barriers that if we can get women stabilized in housing, we have a lot of short-term recovery housing. 3 months now, get it together, pull yourself by the bootstraps. They don't have any boots. What are they going to pull up? So it's like you expect, or you're back out in the street. So really they're living in survival mode at every moment in time. So it's that secure housing. That's one of the biggest barriers I see, just first and foremost.
Thank you, Cherie. And if I could follow up with a question, I'm just wondering, so how do you empower, these women to, fight back against these injustices and even self-advocate?
Yeah, several ways, right? First, we stick together. Oh, you've got a meeting, a prime example, you got a meeting with public housing and you've got these 3 felonies that were simple possession because your substance use disorder and they're about to deny you. Well, guess what? There's going to be 3 of us and we're all going to bear witness and we're going to talk about your supports. And they got it. Now, if they went alone, we know what happens. So we're going to start shining that light, right? At Hawthorne effect, we're going to start coming in as a team, as a group. No more women are coming alone. So we got to show people that we've got their back. And I think that's like just into like how we do it first and foremost. And then, like Danielle and you both shared, or like not relying on these systems, right? Really doing it ourselves as a community, supporting one another, watching each other's children because we can't afford childcare while the system's paying for other people to get the childcare that they took your child away from. You're like, this is insane. So those types of things like mutual aid and emergency crisis fund, like really coming together and supporting each other in that way. And then just taking these stories back up to these, systems and structures and say, hey, something's got to be done. We're done. And empowering those women to share their stories to make sure it's changed, because we don't want to hear in this day and age, I didn't know that was happening. It was happening. We're going to continue to let people know what's happening until something changes. So I think that at the core, that's how we kind of come at it. And that's our motto, like we're stronger together. Oh, you got a hearing, we'll be there. You got this, we'll be there. Family court, oh, let me call someone I know over at Child Welfare, let me get on this. So I think it's like this support system we created that really helps.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. We're going to move into Q&A from the audience. And the first question I wanted to take, I've never seen this question posted before, so I'm excited to hear what you all think. This individual says, thank you for your thoughtful, poignant, and passionate comments about your respective experiences. I have served on my state's parole board for 24 years. I would appreciate your reflections on your encounters with the parole boards before which you appeared. What recommendations might you have for those of us who serve or have served on state parole boards? Yeah, Daniela.
Okay, I can take that one because I did go before the parole board to secure. And I would just say that the people are intimidated to go before the parole board. Typically, you know, they are former law enforcement, predominantly white men, and judge over someone's future. So folks are nervous and therefore can't really articulate what they wish they could articulate because they're nervous. So I think that's one thing that I would hope that parole boards would take into consideration. The fact that everyone isn't like a public speaker, the fact that folks don't have access to education. Even when we talk about higher education in prison, there's still long waiting lists for people to, you know, get involved. So taking that into consideration when folks are sitting across from you trying to, you know, share their insights, explain why they are having to sit in front of you. But also we talked about intersections and intersectionality. So it's also like, as board commissioners, you know, paying attention to that, listening for these intersections, and making your determination and your assessment through the totality of the evidence. A lot of times, you know, when we're in a parole board, it's not really, we're not there to relitigate the case, right? We're there to see if the person has gained insight, understands, you know, why they are in prison, understands their actions, and understands, you know, that there are consequences, has maintained positive programming while in prison, which is another thing that is really hard to do in prison, considering the control that correctional officers and other staff have over people. So it's really like looking at, you know, some infractions may be really minor, and you may see there may be a trend there. So it's really like looking at and acknowledging those trends, and not holding people, you know, in prison for an additional 5 to 15 years because they got a disciplinary infraction like 5 years ago and it wasn't long enough. But it's really like, you know, listening to all of the evidence, and I mean all the evidence presented during the board, all of the past trauma, all of the accomplishments while in prison, and just allowing the space for a person to, you know, verbalize and get across what they need, while understanding that everyone doesn't have the words, the narratives, the language that we wish that they would. But just meeting people like where they are, but still, while still being able to do your job and, you know, determine a person's suitability for parole.
I haven't sat in front of a board before, but I like every time I know somebody that's going for board, I get so nervous and sick that I can't even imagine how people prepare for that. And so I think I would just say that people are very nervous and may not seem like they can answer the question right. And I, like I said, I've never gone through that, but every time one of my friends is going to board, I get so nervous. I'm like, I don't know how you all do this. Like, this is terrifying. And then also just too, like the disciplinary infractions, a lot of times I feel like that's a reason to not grant parole for people. And I just want to highlight that it's very, very difficult to navigate being in prison without getting an infraction, without getting in trouble, because it can be the simplest things like out of bound. I stepped over this line and now you were out of bounds. So they're like, you know, you don't follow direction. Even having like fights and mutual combats, it's like sometimes you have to defend yourself, and that's not how it's going to be portrayed in a write-up. And so when you're reading, even when you're sitting before the board is just saying, oh, they had a fight and, you know, this is still violence, but it's not, obviously it's not going to go into detail about how maybe you had to defend yourself. And regardless of if you defend yourself and you fight back, you're still going to receive the same disciplinary infraction, which is a fight. Yeah, that's just all I want to highlight.
And I haven't either, but I do know it as, you know, family members, but also, you know, loved ones and community members. Something to remember is they have communities and loved ones and people waiting for them out to support them. And those things you may not be seeing on paper of, you know, elevation, it may really translate to barriers to accessing them inside. So it's not necessarily that they didn't want to or didn't have the motivation, but again, there's these barriers and didn't have the access, which Aminah had kind of shared a little bit about. And then also, you know, people inside, when we talk about disciplinary infractions, and if you know the individual, if it's somebody who has mental health disorders like, you know, severe anxiety or PTSD, ADHD, whatever it is, some of these simple things like stepping on are things that aren't intentional. And they're not even getting this. So we heard the medical care inside. It's atrocious, right? They're not getting it at all. If anything, they're getting re-traumatized over and over again. So just to be above board, I mean, I think just trying to look at the person, try to take that individual and how they come and not put so much weight on certain things that may be out of their control, whether it's from a medical reason or access because the offerings just aren't there, particularly in women's prisons, right? So we know that. So I think as a parole board, really thinking about that and knowing, you know, we had one of our members who she was going up and we had sent in, you know, collaborating and 25, you know, individuals, organizations, you know, send something and say, hey, we're waiting with our arms open, you know, please send this person home, you know. And I think knowing that there's a community out there and seeing those letters, put more weight to that sometimes than to what's offered inside, because it just may not be.
Yeah, those are really powerful responses. And in my experience of folks that I have worked with in prison and education units, they've often asked me if they need to take more classes to prove to the parole board that they deserve freedom. And so I strongly caution a parole board from thinking that education is the thing that proves a person should be free. Those classrooms don't provide learning disability accommodations. They're ableist. The quality of education is subpar. Oftentimes the people are in multiple classrooms at varying age groups or varying learning levels. There aren't, students could be in a classroom and English is their third language and the instructor only speaks English. And as much good as academia does, it's incredibly classist. So I would caution any parole board from looking at someone's record and saying, you didn't take advantage of education, therefore you don't deserve freedom. That's a scary thought to me. Another question that has been posed is, for those of us who want to get involved in abolition and supporting incarcerated women, where do you need the most support? What would be the most helpful?
I think Sherry highlighted housing. Housing. But here in the Bay Area, there are several programs like reentry homes where people have volunteered their homes, or like there's specific programs or like housing where people are renting out their houses or allowing incarcerated men to come live together, right? And for women, there's just not a lot of opportunities for housing. But also a lot of the work that we've done personally, like Aminah and myself, is when somebody's coming home, we know a woman is coming home, we do create a care package for them, right? Because we know they're not going to get it from anywhere else, right? So that is like hygiene, that is like clothing, that is like bed sheets, things like that. that we know they're not going to get from anywhere else. Sometimes it's providing, money or gift cards, just making sure they have something when they come home, because we know that, there's nowhere else is going to provide that. They're not going to get that from their parole officer. They're not going to get that from any system, and they're going to come home with $200 being released from prison and having to make that stretch.
Yeah. And for folks that are inside of prison, I mean, we think about, people need commutation, clemency support, because a lot of the people that I work with, particularly are long-termers, lifers, or serving life without the possibility of parole sentences. So people need commutation support. People need board prep support, because it takes years to prepare for a board hearing. Because a lot of people don't even recognize that they are survivors of domestic violence until years later, after they developed a course and then learned that, hey, I suffer from this. So helping people to, prepare for board by sending in collaborating with people on the inside, creating curriculum for courses, because as Daniela said before, we had to create our own programs, workshops, courses, and classes in order to gain insights. And so helping to support with curriculum building. Also, policy and legislation, right now, our laws and we have laws on the books that don't allow room to recognizing past traumas or harms, or even factoring in people's victimization when establishing culpability or in sentencing. So if people are interested in law or policy work, it's really getting in there and looking at the laws we currently have on the books and finding ways to, heal instead of harming people through over incarceration. But there are many avenues to get involved and helping, depending on what your passion is. But however, from whatever facet, we just strongly urge that, get in there and support these women that are incarcerated.
If someone's asking that question of themselves, start to identify what your strengths, talents, social capital is that you can lend to this, whether it was any one of those areas. And if you're saying, I don't really, make a human connection, because there's women in there, and write a letter, make a human connection, start to get to know the individual and what it is and their goals in life, and supporting that, partnering with organizations run by directly impacted people, and offering those, but really knowing what your strengths, talents, and that social capital you possess and you can lend to this. Because again, women's voices are constantly muffled. They're the ones least heard. So we need as many people as we can to help support that movement and really, free our women. I mean, Aminah talked about, clemency and pardons, and, we have women who are survived and punished here in Rhode Island. And we had a rally with the National Council and, really trying to get our women out. And we need more people to share that. And I think by the connections, we started gaining resources to help that cause for one woman who's inside. So it's like, as long, just come, if you're like, I don't think I have anything, just ask or find your talents. There's always something that, you can do to lend your support. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many fantastic questions. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get to them all because we only have about 4 minutes left. But quite a few folks want to know how they can get a hold of each of you offline to know more. A lot of folks saying they want to know about programming in Rhode Island and how they can get involved with that. So I'm going to put that there. I want to ask just a closing question from each of you as we depart. This is an archive. In 150 years, if we no longer have mass incarceration or incarceration period, which I personally hope we will move away from the system, what do you want that future society to know about this particular point in history? What do you not want forgotten? And so maybe we could do a lightning round for the three of you in the last 3 minutes that we have.
I could start. You know, I would want folks to know and to remember that abolition, not abolition, but mass incarceration or vestiges of slavery find a way to create themselves. And if 150 years mass incarceration is gone, I would caution people to not get relaxed and think that everything is okay, because abolition is a marathon, is not a race, and there will always be something else that the system will try to, construct, that we will be trying to deconstruct. So it's really staying in the know, making sure like we are sharing information and that we are, paying attention to systems and what they're doing.
I'll just briefly say to continue to imagine a world that you would like to exist, continue to learn from the past and how what has worked and what hasn't worked. Be cautious of reform efforts that just continue to expand the carceral system. Yeah, that's just what I would say. Is just continue to dream and envision the world that you all want to live in, and invest in community.
Yeah, great thoughts. And, I just look at everything from a human-centered lens, right? And making sure like you're seeing these policies and these practices, remember, and I think like Aminah put, like even if it went away, it still can creep back up on us. It's, this is oppression, this is control. This is when we start to see these types of character traits in our leaders and our legislators and society, then we know we really got to dig in our heels and rise up and keep that message going, that this can happen again, because history is here. We have all the history to show us. So don't forget the history. Remember that. Don't forget it. The answers are all there for us. So just look back to answer some of your questions of how things turn out and how things can happen so quickly and turn badly for us as a society.
Aminah, Cherie, Daniela, thank you very much for joining today. Incredibly, incredibly appreciative. I also want to thank again all of the families who contributed their testimony to the archive, to the families and to the individuals. It's been a privilege and an honor to be privy to your stories. So thank you for making this archive possible. Want to remind everyone to follow the newsletter for the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. The newsletter will announce the launch of the archive next week. We hope to hear from you. We hope to stay in conversation and collaboration and continue to work towards a better future. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.